After 2 weeks of restraint and growing trust, a single gunshot was enough to undo everything. On Tanna, friendship collapsed in an instant. Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. This podcast follows the second voyage of Captain James Cook and the German-born naturalist Georg Forster through the Pacific in the 18th century. In this episode, the expedition's time on Tanna comes to an end, and the Resolution leaves the island behind to return to the open sea. What happened in the last episode? In the previous episode, the expedition continued its careful exploration of Tanna, moving between volcanic ground, cultivated gardens, and dense forests. Encounters with the islanders alternated between mistrust and growing familiarity, as guides misled the Europeans one moment and welcomed them the next. Botanical and geological observations deepened, while fragile trust slowly took shape, setting the stage for decisions that would soon carry far greater consequences. Wednesday, August 17th, 1774, Island of Tanna, Vanuatu.
They spent the rest of the day on the plain behind the water source, trying to shoot down the blossom of an unknown tree with the air rifle. Toward evening, the sailors caught around 100 kilograms of fish, providing the entire crew with a fresh meal. Meanwhile, Dr. Sparman and Georg returned once more to the high plateau to visit their local acquaintances. By now, it had become a habit to entertain them with songs. They sang again this time, which earned them much affection. Eventually, some men pointed to girls, offering them, out of exaggerated but not unusual hospitality among indigenous peoples, to their guests in discreet fashion. The girls quickly understood the suggestion, fled in fright, and appeared not only afraid, but also indignant. The men, especially the younger ones, urged Georg and Sparman to run after them, perhaps only to scare them. In any case, they took no offense when Georg and his companion declined the offer. As a farewell, they gave their hosts small gifts, including pearl-shell fish hooks with tips made of tortoiseshell, and received various fruits in return. By the morning of the 19th, the supplies of drinking water, firewood, and ballast had been replenished enough since their arrival that they planned to set sail. But the wind thwarted their plans, blowing directly into the mouth of the harbor. After breakfast, they went ashore with the captain as usual. The commander wanted to trade with the locals, while they themselves wished to take one final walk across the island. Each chose his own path. On the one Georg took, he encountered a large number of islanders heading toward the beach. Not one stood in his way. They all stepped aside to let him pass. Even though they saw that Georg was walking alone, none of them showed a hostile face. The young naturalist took this as an invitation to extend his walk even farther. Thus, Georg reached the valley on the southern side of the plateau, further inland than he had ever been before. Dense forest surrounded him on all sides. Only occasionally did gaps between the trees reveal the landscape, but when they did, the view was all the more captivating. Georg saw part of the plantations on the slopes where the locals were working. They were felling or trimming trees, cultivating the soil, using a dry branch instead of a spade, and planting yams or other roots. At one spot, he heard a man singing while he worked. From the melody, Georg recognized one of the songs that had often been sung to him at the huts. The landscape was beautiful. Even Tahiti could hardly compare. There, the flat land never extended more than about 3 kilometers in width, and was usually bordered by massive cliffs with sharp peaks that looked ready to collapse. Here, however, a much larger expanse lay before Georg, with gently rolling hills and wide valleys, all cultivable. Even the plantations didn't block the view, as they mostly consisted of bananas, yams, arum, and sugarcane, all low-growing plants. Even the banana trees were no exception. Their trunks usually reached no more than 1.8 meters in height, rarely up to 3. From a small rise, one could see over entire forests of such plants. Now and then, a single tree with its dense canopy rose above them, each one more picturesque than the last. In the background, the view was framed by a ridge topped with groves of trees, from which the majestic crowns of coconut palms rose in great numbers. Only someone who had personally experienced how the beauty of nature touches a sensitive heart could understand how even the simplest things could suddenly become meaningful and stir deep emotions. In such moments, even the sight of a freshly plowed field could spark delight. One felt a quiet joy in the soft green of the meadows, in the different shades of foliage, the countless number of leaves, and their variety in size and shape. This diversity of nature was spread out in all its splendor before Georg. The varying light on the trees created a vivid play of colors. Here, the foliage shimmered golden in the sunlight. There, dark shadows brought soothing calm to the overstimulated eye. Blue smoke rising in rings among the trees reminded the young naturalist of the quiet joys of domestic life. The vast banana groves with their golden, grape-like fruit seemed like a symbol of peace and abundance. This sight filled Georg with thoughts of friendship and the happiness of an entire people. The song of a working farmer, which rang out at that very moment, completed the picture like the final brush stroke. To the west, the landscape was no less impressive. A fertile plain gave way to a series of hills, where forests and orchards alternated. Beyond them, mountains rose, comparable in height to those of the Society Islands, though they appeared less steep and rugged. Even the spot from which Georg took in this view had not been left without beauty by nature. A group of lovely trees stood there, their trunks entwined with fragrant climbing plants and morning glories. The ground was unusually fertile, so much so that even palm trees knocked over by the wind had raised their crowns once more from the soil and sprouted fresh green shoots. But this shouldn't be taken as a sign of particularly stormy weather on Tanna. On the contrary, the real reason lay in the short, fibrous roots of the coconut palms and the loose texture of the soil. It didn't take a strong wind to topple such trees. Colorful birds enlivened this shaded place and surprised the ear with melodious song. A clear sky stretched above Georg, and the cool sea breeze whispered around him. He stood still and simply enjoyed the happiness that such a harmony of beautiful impressions could bring. Without warning, Georg drifted into thoughts about what their stay among the islanders might have truly accomplished, and how much comfort he found in the calming, still completely carefree idea that they had represented humanity in the best possible light. For 14 days, they had lived among a people who had initially been mistrustful and ready to repay even the smallest hostility with resolve. Yet they had managed to overcome this suspicion through calm and thoughtful behavior, restraint, and consistency in their actions. People who had never before in their lives encountered such peaceful, yet courageous and dignified foreigners had, through their example, learned to hold others in higher regard. As soon as the primitive instinct for self-preservation had been soothed, another drive stirred in the hearts of the islanders, just as powerful: the desire for community. No sooner did they realize the foreigners weren't there to take their fruits by force than they began to share them willingly. Soon, they welcomed them into their shaded homes and allowed them to sit among them like family. After only a few days, they even began to enjoy their company. And now their hearts opened to a new selfless emotion: friendship. What a precious awareness, Georg thought, to have contributed to a people's happiness in this way. What a privilege to belong to a civilized society capable of such things, and of sharing them with others. Just then, the sound of someone approaching broke his train of thought. It was Dr. Sparman. Georg showed him the landscape and shared the thoughts it had stirred in him. Sparman's empathetic response heightened Georg's feelings even further, but the two of them finally had to tear themselves away and return to the ship, as it was already nearing midday. The first islander they encountered ran off and hid in the bushes. Shortly after, they met a woman at the edge of a plantation who also would have liked to flee, but no longer dared. With trembling hands and a frightened expression, she handed them a basket of jumbo apples. Her behavior puzzled them both. They bought the fruit and moved on. In and around the plantation stood many men hiding in the brush, all of them waving persistently for the two to return to the beach. When Georg and his companion emerged from the forest, the reason became clear. Two men sat in the grass holding a third, who lay dead in their arms. They pointed to a wound in his side, a gunshot, and with a look of deep grief said, "He has been killed." In their language, a single word expressed this even more powerfully: Markom. They hurried to the beach, where their group was usually stationed. But not a single islander was to be found among them. Soon, they learned what had happened. As usual, a guard had been posted to secure the area where their men were working. The islanders were forbidden to enter this space, while the sailors could cross the line and mingle with the locals at any time. A man from the island, possibly visiting the beach for the first time, had pushed forward and tried to cross into the restricted area. Since their men believed the space to be theirs alone, the guard grabbed the man by the arm and pushed him back. But the islander, believing that no foreigner had the right to order him around on his own land, tried again, likely just to prove that he could walk wherever he pleased. The guard shoved him back a second time, this time so roughly that even someone more even-tempered than an islander would have lost his temper. It was hardly surprising, then, that he strung an arrow to defend his wounded sense of freedom. The soldier saw the danger instantly, raised his musket, and shot the man dead on the spot. At that moment, the captain arrived at the beach and saw the rest of the islanders fleeing from those cruel foreigners who dared commit such injustices on foreign soil. The captain immediately ordered the soldier to be arrested and returned to the ship, then made every effort to calm the population. Some islanders, especially those from the eastern highlands, did allow themselves to be reassured, and slowly began to trust again those who had just so grievously violated the sacred law of hospitality. It was a moving testament to the fundamentally good nature of humanity. Equally remarkable was the restraint the islanders showed in doing no harm to Georg or Dr. Sparman, even though they could easily have avenged their fallen companion on these two.
To understand what happened here, it is important to pause for a moment. In the 18th century, European firearms were not only weapons of war, they were also instruments of intimidation, warning, and control. A single shot could be fired without the intention to kill, meant to frighten, disperse, or enforce distance. Within European military thinking, such a shot did not necessarily signal escalation, but often the opposite, an attempt to prevent further violence. But this logic depended entirely on shared assumptions. For those who had never encountered firearms before, the sound itself carried no graduated meaning. There was no distinction between warning and attack. The weapon spoke only one language, and it spoke with finality. On Tanna, the gunshot did not function as a signal. It became an act. Whether intended or not, it crossed a boundary that could not be explained away, negotiated, or undone. What the Europeans understood as control was experienced by the islanders as sudden, incomprehensible violence. In moments like this, misunderstanding was not a matter of words, but of worlds colliding. With the meaning of the gunshot fixed in this way, the reaction of the islanders became immediate and irreversible.
Georg and the naturalist returned to the ship with the captain, not without concern for Georg's father, who, completely unaware, was still wandering the forest, accompanied by only a single sailor. But the outcome was better than they feared. A quarter of an hour later, they saw him safe and sound near the guard post, watching over the water barrels on the beach, and they immediately sent a boat to pick him up. The islanders had held Georg's father no more responsible for the killing of their clansmen than they had held Georg or Sparman. It seemed they had formed too favorable an opinion of their characters to blame the entire group for the crime of one man. But how quickly, and by what ruthless act, had the beautiful hopes Georg had harbored just moments before been shattered? What must the islanders now think of them? Were they really better than other foreigners? Or did they deserve even more scorn for having wormed their way into people's trust under the guise of friendship, only to act as murderers? Georg had to admit that many of their crewmen were right to speak openly of their dismay. Incidents like these had happened to them almost everywhere, and the damage was always beyond repair. And now, on Tanna, where they had conducted themselves more civilly and sensibly than at any other place, their good reputation had been destroyed by a single act of cruelty. The captain wanted to punish the soldier as severely as possible, for he had gone against an explicit order, the command that any outburst from the islanders must always be met with patience. But the officer in charge at the beach defended the soldier. He admitted that he had never passed that order on. Instead, he had told his men they should shoot the islanders immediately if they showed any sign of threatening behavior. Because of this confession, the soldier could not be held accountable. Whether the officer even had the authority to decide over the lives of the islanders, that was not investigated further. It was known that the officer had many influential relatives, including ministers, and besides, it seemed that in England it didn't weigh too heavily when a subordinate failed in his duty or violated protocol. There were even cases of officers being dishonorably discharged, only to become state ministers shortly thereafter. Every country had its own ways, after all. After the meal, they returned to land once more. The sailors tried their luck fishing, and with some success. Very few islanders were present, and most were unarmed, so the murder of their clansmen seemed either forgotten or at least forgiven. Georg's father, Dr. Sparman, and Georg went to the plain to hunt birds. Even there, they saw only a single islander. He immediately turned onto another path and tried to flee as fast as he could when he noticed them. But they called after him and, with every gesture of friendliness they could convey without words, persuaded him to return. With a wary, timid look, he slowly approached. Eventually, they reassured him with various gifts, parted as good friends, and returned with the entire crew to the ship, quite late in the day. The next morning, they saw several canoes with sails raised leaving the harbor. In shape, they closely resembled the boats built on the Friendly Islands, though the ones here were clearly of inferior craftsmanship. All boats had outriggers and could carry up to 20 people. The sails were low and made from triangular mats, with the wide end at the top and the pointed end at the bottom. A long, hollowed-out tree trunk formed the body of each boat. The sidewalls consisted of 1 or 2 planks laid on top of each other, tied together with coconut fiber ropes in the following way. The outside of the planks was smoothed completely flat, while on the inside, small raised knobs were left at regular intervals. These were drilled vertically and protruded like firmly anchored rings. The ropes were threaded through these holes and tied tightly, securing the planks together. From the outside, neither the holes nor the cords were visible. The paddles were poorly made in every respect, both in form and workmanship. The fact that the people of Tanna did not build their boats or perform other work with the same care and refinement as the people of the Friendly Islands likely stemmed from their constant state of warfare, which left them little time for such efforts. Now that the wind was favorable, they raised anchor and departed the island on August 20th, after a stay of 16 days.
When Georg Forster wrote that the damage was beyond repair, he was not speaking metaphorically. In the context of 18th century encounters, the spilling of blood fundamentally altered the terms of contact. Such expeditions operated on fragile balances of trust, reputation, and restraint. Once violence occurred, every subsequent interaction became dangerous, not only because of possible retaliation, but because intentions could no longer be read or trusted. Any renewed approach risked collective punishment, ambush, or escalation far beyond the original incident. For European commanders, withdrawal was therefore not an admission of guilt or weakness. It was a calculation. Leaving meant containing the damage, preventing further death, and preserving the possibility, however distant, of future contact under different circumstances. To remain would have meant forcing the situation, and force, once introduced, rarely remained limited. In this sense, retreat was the only responsible choice available. It was with this understanding that the expedition prepared to leave Tanna behind and return to the sea.
Tanna lay at 19 degrees, 30 seconds south latitude, and 169 degrees, 38 seconds east longitude. Its circumference was little more than 44 kilometers. As far as they had been able to investigate, the mountains consisted mostly of clay-like rock interspersed with fragments of chalk. This clay was almost always brown or yellowish and lay in nearly horizontal layers about 15 centimeters thick. In some places, these layers alternated with a kind of soft black rock that seemed to be a mixture of volcanic ash, shoral grains, and some clay, or a Tripoli-like substance. This volcanic ash, combined with rich black soil, formed the fertile ground in which the plants thrived so well. All of these mixtures, both in the soil and in the other mineral products, were, to a large extent, the work of the volcano. For example, the white clay covering the solfatara contained native sulfur and had an astringent taste, as if it were mixed with alum. In the same area, they also found red bolas. There also appeared to be selenite, as the ornaments worn through the pierced nasal cartilage of the inhabitants seemed to be made of this type of stone. They only saw lava in scattered, coarse forms. Near the volcano, where they were not allowed to go, there was likely more and greater variety. The hot spring water had an astringent taste as well, indicating the presence of additional mineral substances. However, they did not have the time to determine its exact composition through chemical experiments. The volcano itself would certainly have provided many opportunities for new observations due to its current activity, had the islanders not kept them at a distance out of distrust. As it was, they had to settle for observing it from afar. This merely confirmed the well-known observation that volcanoes do not always erupt from the highest peaks of a mountain range, as in Peru or Sicily, but can also break through a secondary, lower chain of hills and often rise to only modest heights. Moreover, since volcanoes had been known to form even from the depths of the sea, at completely unfathomable locations, like in the Azores and throughout the archipelago, it was astonishing that so many naturalists still blindly followed the purely speculative philosopher Buffon, treating his claim as fact that volcanoes could only exist in the highest mountains, since underground fire, he claimed, could only exist near the Earth's surface. A second observation they made concerning the volcano on Tanna was that the most violent eruptions usually followed rainfall. Their stay had been too short to confirm this often enough themselves, but the experiences of other naturalists had already sufficiently established this rule. The plant life on Tanna was extremely rich, both in the number and diversity of species. Many plants in the forests were entirely unknown to them, or found only on the East Indian Islands. The plantations also featured numerous herbs and root vegetables unknown on the Society and Friendly Islands. There were likely over 40 such cultivated and deliberately propagated plant varieties. Among the wild-growing species, the nutmeg tree was particularly noteworthy, since Quiros had described this spice as a product of his Tierra del Espíritu Santo, a land that undoubtedly belonged to this island group. Oranges were also present, though Georg could not determine whether they were cultivated or wild, as they never saw the tree itself. Only the fruits the women offered for sale. The animal kingdom was no less diverse and included many beautiful species. Fish were present in great variety and abundance. The crew caught, using both nets and lines, a kind of mullet, Brazilian pike, snapper, dorado, cavalhas, parrotfish, venomous rays, toothless rays, angelfish, sharks and suckerfish, various species of mackerel, and fish known as thickheads. Shellfish were rare. The locals fetched them from neighboring islands and preferred the mother-of-pearl inside their shells over all other materials. The forests were teeming with birds, especially many species of pigeons, parrots, and flycatchers. Among the latter, they even found one species common in New Zealand. They also discovered a Ceylonese owl, a type of tree creeper, a species of duck, and the purple gallinule. These animals were mostly very shy, indicating they were hunted by the islanders. Chickens and pigs were the only domesticated animals kept by the locals. Among wild four-legged animals, there were only rats and bats, which Georg had already mentioned earlier. This island of Tanna, so richly endowed by nature and enjoying a mild climate despite its tropical location, was inhabited by a people less developed than those of the Society and Friendly Islands, even though those lay at nearly the same latitude, just farther east. The population numbered at most around 20,000 people. In terms of cultivation, they had not yet made much progress, especially when considering the island's size, with the exception of the eastern plateau above the harbor, which was without doubt the most fertile region Georg had seen in all of the South Seas. One might have wondered why so much of the land on Tanna remained unused despite its fertility. At first glance, one might think that fertile soil would make agriculture easier. But, on the contrary, it made it harder, especially in the beginning. Wild plants, which reproduce on their own through seeds or roots, were much harder to eliminate the more nutrients they found in the soil. Until they were fully suppressed, the more delicate cultivated plants were at constant risk of being overrun or smothered. These two factors led Georg to conclude that Tanna's population was far lower than the island could have supported. The people lived in small villages made up of only a few families. Their habit of always being armed was a clear sign that they had fought wars in the past, perhaps even at that time, either against neighboring islanders or among themselves. These internal conflicts may have been caused by the settlement of people from different backgrounds who later fought over land. This theory was supported by the fact that they had encountered 3 different languages. One was the most widespread, another resembled the language of the Friendly Islands, and a third was spoken mainly by the inhabitants on the western side of the harbor. That these 3 languages differed fundamentally became especially evident through their numerals. In the most common language, Georg noted 2 or 3 words clearly related to the language of Malekolo, and just as many that matched Malay. Overall, however, none of the 3 languages had much in common with any known tongue. Many of the words were breathy. Others included frequent guttural sounds. Yet everything was so filled with vowels that pronunciation was easy and the sound pleasant. The limited size of the South Pacific Islands and the complete absence of wild mammals had prevented the first settlers from relying on hunting or livestock alone, as many other indigenous peoples did. From the start, they had to focus on agriculture, especially in regions where fish were scarce. Without this necessity, the people of the tropical islands might never have reached the level of development that Georg and his companions found. The degree to which one people had advanced beyond another could be judged by how much comfort they had invented in their domestic life, or how much refinement they had achieved in their crafts. By that measure, the inhabitants of Tanna were still quite low on the scale. Their houses were little more than huts, built with no thought for comfort, merely as shelter from bad weather. In terms of clothing, another indicator of civilization, they knew nothing. Personal hygiene was also lacking, which made social interactions difficult. Instead of bathing regularly, as the Tahitians and their neighbors did, they preferred to paint themselves with various colors, which more often dirtied them. But despite these shortcomings, there were already signs pointing toward a higher stage of development. Georg counted among them the women's cooking skills, which had benefited from the variety of food available. They knew how to roast or bake yams and bananas, steam green fig leaves and hibiscus, Hibiscus esculentus, and bake puddings made from banana and arum root dough with coconut and leaf filling. They also ate many fruits raw, straight from the tree. Occasionally, they would enjoy a piece of pork or poultry. Fishing provided many meals, as did bird hunting, though the latter was considered more of a delicacy. If the enjoyment of varied food were to increase and spread among the people, agriculture, craftsmanship, and other prosperity-related arts would soon make greater progress. Even hard labor becomes light and pleasant when done voluntarily, or when it brings pleasure to the senses. Once refinement began in one area of life, it would inevitably spread to others. Already, music on Tanna had reached a more advanced level than anywhere else in the South Pacific, and an interest in harmonious sounds always implied a certain sensitivity, which in turn paved the way for moral development. Their political structure was, as expected for the people's current state, still very simple. Every village and family was independent, uniting with others only when absolutely necessary, such as in the face of an outside threat. Older men with proven courage were respected to some degree, but a fixed hierarchy or system of ranks was still unknown. The conflicting interests of many small groups led to frequent disputes, constantly fueling mistrust and a desire for revenge. Only an increase in population could counter this in the long term, since a larger number of people would raise the need for social organization and a more stable form of government. The making of weapons, which currently consumed a great deal of their time, could then be reserved for leisure hours as a pastime. The consequences of such inner peace, mutual trust, and general safety would give them the freedom to refine their crafts, just like the people of the Society Islands had done. How much trade with neighboring islands could accelerate such development was hard to say. But one thing was certain: commerce greatly encouraged the rise of civilization. As for religion, they could say nothing for certain about the people of Tanna. The solemn singing heard almost every morning at the eastern tip of the bay suggested that there was a sacred gathering place somewhere in the forest, but this could not be confirmed, as the locals always kept them away from the area. In their everyday behavior, there were no visible signs of religious practice. Neither piety nor superstition could be observed. One might have interpreted their custom of not touching gifts with bare hands, but rather using a fresh leaf as symbolic. Yet even this gesture was not consistently upheld, and often disappeared once familiarity had been established. Still, Georg was convinced that even this people was not without religion. The idea of a higher being exists even among the most uneducated. Only the pressure of immediate needs keeps people from devoting time to it. But once these needs can be met with less effort and in less time, the human mind begins to unfold and eventually rises to thoughts beyond the visible world. Thus, the development of religious awareness was closely tied to the progress of civilization. No one could expect more accurate or important observations, let alone a full picture of the islanders' knowledge, given the shortness of their stay and the initial mistrust they had faced. That very mistrust was to blame for why so many aspects of daily life had remained completely unknown to them. It was likely that the people of Tanna also had certain customs surrounding special occasions, such as weddings, births, or deaths. These customs may have been as simple as possible, but still contributed valuable insight into their character. Captain Cook discovered a burial site during a walk. It was smaller than the typical dwellings and located within a plantation. Curious, he persuaded an older man to accompany him inside. The hut was surrounded by a low fence, with one side so short that it could be easily stepped over. One end of the hut was closed, the other had once been open, but was now covered with mats that the old man neither wanted to remove nor push aside. At this very end hung a basket made of woven mats, containing a piece of yam root and some fresh leaves. When Cook tried to move closer, the old man became uneasy. He wouldn't even allow the sailor to continue looking at the basket. With gestures, the man indicated that a body lay inside the hut. The old man wore a necklace strung with 2 or 3 locks of human hair, and a woman beside him had even more. Cook tried to barter for this adornment, but they made it clear that the hair had belonged to the deceased and could not be given away. This confirmed that, as in Tahiti, the Marquesas, and New Zealand, the people of Tanna wore the hair of the dead as a keepsake or sign of mourning. Whether, as in Tahiti, the dead were left to decompose above ground or were buried, remained unclear. What Georg and his companions had observed themselves was this: the people of Tanna were more serious in demeanor than those of the Society Islands, even more so than the inhabitants of Malakolo. The families on the plateau had shown themselves to be hospitable and humane, unless fear for their safety prevented them from doing so. In their treatment of women, they did not behave as kindly as one might have wished, but by far not as harshly as the New Zealanders. In fact, they seemed to be approaching the gentleness observed among the people of the Society and Friendly Islands. That they were brave was evident at every opportunity. Georg even had to regard them as noble-minded, for their conduct after the death of their fellow tribesmen, especially toward Sparman and himself, had been remarkable. Nor were they lacking in intelligence. Georg and the others had often observed this, sometimes in truly admirable ways. That was the good side. The other revealed itself in their deep mistrust and their constant state of armament. That they had referred to themselves as cannibals suggested that they were vengeful and unable to restrain their passions. Perhaps contact with Europeans might have brought about change, perhaps even progress toward a more civilized state, had it not been for that one thoughtless incident that ruined everything. European goods had little or no value to them, but after Georg's group had given them many nails and some axes, they would likely learn to appreciate the value of metal through its durability. Perhaps, during the next visit by a European ship, they would be willing to trade food in return. And so they now found themselves back at sea, heading eastward toward the island of Iranan. Their stay on Tanna had brought them 3 or 4 meals of fresh fish, as well as a small supply of yams, but this was reserved for the sick. Now, cases of fever were spreading among the sailors, and only these patients were allowed small portions of yam in place of the unhealthy ship's biscuits and salted beef.
This part of the voyage ends in silence rather than resolution. The island of Tanna is left behind, marked by an encounter that could not be repaired and a moment that changed everything that followed. A map tracing the route of this episode, along with access to present-day impressions of these places, can be found via the link in the show notes. The journey continues here on the channel. Subscribing, exploring the playlist, or supporting the project via PayPal helps keep it alive. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.